do that. Okay, well, thanks for everybody for coming and joining in this. Let's see if I can. Do you guys have a share okay, or do I need to start the
We can
presentation?
share. We can see you.
Okay, good. So this is descriptive scientific phenomenology. Giorgi, when he and the others at Duquesne started this, it was phenomenological psychology. It was also called existential psychology. So it's gone through some different names for some different reasons. And one of the reasons, actually, it's descriptive scientific phenomenology is because in the last probably 10 to 20 years, a lot of different disciplines in academia have been using Giorgi's method to discover different phenomenon, from nursing in Europe. You know, of course, my discipline is emergency services, and psychology, and some other disciplines. So he just wanted to distinguish it from transcendental phenomenology, from Husserl's philosophical phenomenology, and call it scientific. So that's kind of why it's the way it is today.
You do need the PowerPoint back on, though.
Say that again?
The PowerPoint's not showing.
Oh, well, I see it just great.
We're reading your mind.
Oh, well, then there's that. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So I think we're there now. Are
Yes.
we? Yeah, we are. Cool. I got to move the Brady Bunch thing. Okay. So phenomenology is the philosophical study of consciousness, which really means mind, psyche, or spirit as such. So it's pure mind, and that kind of take is what really got Husserl accused of being an idealist, or the idea that the mind or the spirit is reality and the body is added to that, and that was an approach to philosophy that was big in Germany at the time. It was German idealism. Kant was an idealist, and others. But scientific phenomenology is the study of human consciousness. So we actually study data that we get from actual human beings about their study, or about their lives, and we study those events. And so that's what really distinguishes philosophical phenomenology from scientific phenomenology. According to James, consciousness is subjective and private, which means other people don't have direct access to our minds. We only are the ones that have access to our own minds. And our minds are constantly changing. There's a stream of consciousness and a stream of experience that is going on all the time. So it's kind of this idea that there's an ongoing inner movie that happens for us and that we experience, and that it's continuous. It's noetic in that it has a function of knowing intentionality or content. And that's really, really key when we look at Dreyfus's work on artificial intelligence. The idea is that no matter how complex our machines get in computer science, we'll never have a computer that will have a what is it like to be that computer. There will never be an actual subjective experiencing like we have. And it's characterized by selective attention. So what's really interesting, and this is the thing that gets that goes into the notion that everybody experiences everything different, or what mainstream psychology would say is we all perceive the world different, is because we have selective attention, and those things that are concernful to one person is not necessarily concernful to others, or we have different concernfulness based on our history. So William James was really an anticipation to phenomenology in so many ways, and so his philosophy of the mind and stream of experience are very much in line with Husserl. Let's see. So intentionality, when we're doing phenomenological analysis, is really, really important for learners to understand when they're going to analyze data, because intentionality is the subject or the person that had the experience and some sort of mental act or acts that that then are pointed at objects or state of affairs in the world. And this is really vital to understand, because this is the lowest um, sort of unit that we analyze when we're doing a phenomenological analysis. The key here is really the mental act and the object or state of affairs that intentionality is pointed at, because the subject is always our participant. So this is where our participant's point of view is always the subject. And so when we're looking at meaning units, which I'll describe a little bit more later, when we're looking at the meaning units, we're looking at these things in terms of how did the participant hope for, um, see, hear, want, or be fearful of an object or state of affairs. So that concept of intentionality is one that Husserl uh, brought into phenomenological psychology in phenomenology from Franz Brentano, that was a psychologist that was his contemporary, that he learned from actually in the university. So that brings us to bracketing. If we really want to look at the intentional structures of how somebody experiences something, the first thing that we need to do is kind of suspend our theoretical and experiential presuppositions about that act of consciousness or about that situation. Um, so a lot of people really confuse bracketing with some sort of amnesia, like you're supposed to forget everything that you know about psychology. And of course, all of us that are theorists and psychologists and researchers, we can't forget what we know, and we certainly can't forget what we know about the subject matter, having done the lit review. And that's not what's expected. What's expected is to put it in brackets very similar to what you would find in an algebraic equation. You know, Husserl was a mathematician, so the idea was that you take that part of the equation, what you understand, and you set it aside so that you can see the experience or the data. You can see it new, as without all of that kind of baggage. So it's to take a fresh look, and actually a cool kind of way to look at it comes from Eastern thought, and it's to take the novice mind, to take the mind of a child at looking at this kind of a thing, which involves a certain kind of curiosity in looking at the data, and sort of wondering if the way that it presents itself to the researcher is accurate, or if we should really kind of suspend even further and see if there's something there that we haven't considered before. So when identifying that learner is not bracketing, so you have a learner that has done an analysis or made the first attempt, the first thing that you want to look for is the learner starting to make explanations? Because explanations involve interpretation. And oftentimes those are marked by the discipline's jargon or theoretical jargon. For example, the Freudian stuff, like the subject was projecting upon the other person, or there's some sort of defense mechanism involved, or even jargon from cognitive psychology that involves this information processing metaphor that cognitive psychology uses. It's very important to kind of pay attention to how they're characterizing the transformations as they do that. The other thing is that the learners that are not bracketed tend to take uh, at face value what the subject said or what the participant said. And so they have a tendency to miss the meta meanings or the context dependent meanings and just merely summarize and characterize those things that were said in the transcript. So to really do the analysis in the way that we need to have it done, there is the employment of imaginative variation. And Giorgi, in his latest works, talks a lot about how Van Manen and Moustakis and other people that have developed phenomenologically inspired methods don't really talk about the mental work. They talk about reflection a little bit. They talk a little bit about dwelling with the data, but they don't talk about what's going on experientially for the researcher. And so Husserl talks about that in his philosophy, and that is, we start to take the act and the object in that intentional structure, and we start to do variations, additions and subtractions. And with the subject matter that we all work with, it's not the same as the physical kinds of examples that Husserl gives us. Like Husserl will say, what's the essence of a chair? What are the essential parts of a chair? And then he goes to, do you need a backrest? And of course, no, we don't need a backrest. A stool is a chair and it doesn't have a backrest. Does it need to have legs on it? Well, no, there's such things as pedestal stools, so it doesn't need that. So when it comes right down to it, when you start to vary this by additions and subtractions, you find out that the essence of the chair is something that elevates somebody off of the floor. And that's pretty much about the essence of a chair. So we have all sorts of different kind of chairs, all the way down to maybe even just a sitting cushion could be considered a chair. But when we're talking about psychology or sociology, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because we're always talking about ideas and concepts and constructs rather than the characteristics of physical object. So in that, we need to guide our learners to start playing around with adjectives for the nouns, the objects and states of affairs, in the verbs and adverbial phrases that characterize the essence of participants' meaning when they express something. So we'll take a meaning unit and we'll see how the person expressed it in their own words. And then what we want to do is look at the mental or social verbs within that and start to think, okay, so it might have been fear generally, but how can we use adjectives and adverbs to change that fear into something that is like a chilling fear, or a hesitant fear, or an anticipatory fear? These kind of things that we take from the context of the whole and start to transform that meaning unit based on its intentional structure. The participant was fearful of the snake, was maybe anticipatorily fearful of the snake, or horrifically fearful of the snake, or whatever the case may be. But we look at that structure. And what's really interesting about the intentional structure is that those of us that may recall from grammar school, and when you're diagramming sentences, you start seeing how these structures are so central to the way that we actually think. That there's always a subject, which is us, an act or a verb, and then the object, and then we change those objects and we change those verbs with modifiers to make them nuanced. And so when somebody is doing a scientific phenomenological analysis on a lived experience, they have to take the participant's language and really analyze that language in the context of the whole story, and try and recharacterize the intentional structure such that it actually unpacks what they really mean, essentially, rather than just what they mean just on the surface in everyday language. So that is how we do the essential meanings and describe them in the transformations. And then once we have all the transformations done, we start looking for key constituents. Now, a counterpart to this with other qualitative methods would be themes. And the reason why Giorgi stayed away from themes is because some themes can stand alone on their own, and themes in other qualitative methods are not always essential to the experience, but might be common among the participants. And what we're looking for in phenomenology is that which is essential to the experience, not just simply common among the participants in how they experience something. So that's why we call them constituents. And again, we look at the intentional structure of the subject, the mental act, and the object and state of affairs, and restate that. So after we get all the transformations done and we've developed titles for all the constituents, or we've named all the categories of mental aspects that went into the experience, then we write a descriptive paragraph. And how that descriptive paragraph should read is how in time this experience unfolded for the participant, and all of the constituents should be identifiable in there, if not by title, somehow identifiable in the way that the paragraph reads. So what I do to have my learners check their work is, once they write the general structure, and again, you have to watch for the unbracketing, you have to watch for explanations when they start to theorize about what was going on for the person, or judge what was going on for the person, rather than just simply describe what the person described to them. We describe how this unfolded in a general sense across all of our participants. And then what I do is I have them use the bubble comments to insert and mark every place in that general structure where a constituent is, and I have them number it with their corresponding number. So it's kind of like checking your work mathematically to make sure that every constituent is accounted for within that general structure. This is very painstaking. By the time you do all of the meaning units, sentence by sentence, line by line through each transcript, you might have maybe 150 meaning units, and each meaning unit takes anywhere from an easy one at 2 minutes to a difficult one 10 minutes to transform. So with 150 meaning units per transcript, you're talking about 450 meaning units at an average of maybe 5 minutes to transform each one. So it's very, very long, and it's very, very painstaking. But to get the kind of detail we want in phenomenology, that's what it takes. So the other part of it too is that, and I'm working on this, and I'm not quite sure if I involved this in here or not. Yeah, I did. So I'll talk about this a little bit later. But once we get the constituents listed, oops, there we go. This one, there we go. Okay, once we get a list of constituents, the other thing that you want to see in Chapter 4 is not only the general structure, but each constituent elaborated upon by the learner. How the constituents sometimes are a little bit contextually different, even though they're categorically the same. They're a little bit different based on the way it was experienced from participant to participant. So the other part of the elaboration of the constituents is sometimes to really talk about how one constituent leads into or depends upon another, because interdependence is really important in the concept of a constituent versus a theme. Again, a theme can stand on its own, but a constituent is interdependent with other constituents in order to belong to the whole. So wholes and parts is a very, very important concept in phenomenology, that every experience always is experienced as a whole, but there are fundamental aspects to that experience that have to be there for that experience to be the kind of experience it is. So the FigureGround relations are kind of where we get into the research question 2, if we have a research question 2, and that is, what are those key constituents that when you look at them are the real hub of the wheel, so to speak, or the real thing that makes that experience the kind of experience it was, while there are other constituents that are just sort of contextual. They have to be there You know, for example, in my study on police shootings, anxiety was a part of the whole experience. It was throughout. There was anxiety from the time the call was announced till even way after the incident was over. So it was contextual and it was kind of the ground, but the figure was actually that piece where the shootout occurred, and what kind of psychological phenomenon happened in that moment or in that event. So this is very related to, and there was a lot of discussion between phenomenologists and Gestalt psychologists at the time about that figure-ground relationship in our perceptual field. So this leads to phenomenological sampling, and I think this is a thing that really sets phenomenology apart uh, from other qualitative and quantitative research. Is that the first step to sampling in phenomenology is to recruit the person that has had the experience of the phenomenon in an event that included or exemplifies the phenomenon. So if we're studying the phenomenon of fear, or fear of falling, then what we're going to do is we're going to look for people that have had an experience of being afraid of falling, whether it's on a cliff's edge, the top of a building, or whatever, and we're going to want to study that event. We use unstructured interviews because if what we do is we lead the witness, so to speak, with a semi-structured or structured interview that's based on our theoretical foundations, then we've loaded the theory into the interview, and then when we go to analyze, we can't say that we bracketed it because all of the answers that we got were based on the theoretical leading. So we audio record typically. It's possible to do phenomenology with having somebody do a written protocol, or to do something that's autobiographical in writing. But typically with what we're going to do with dissertations and things like that is to do an interview that's audio recorded and transcribed for analysis. And each interview is a data set. And this is a thing that's unique, is because the data set is the same kind, doesn't escape us from the fact that all of our participants might be talking about separate and distinct incidents that they experience that have nothing to do with each other. In fact, we don't even need our participants to know each other or be part of a group. It's not a case study where it's bounded as a case. These people can be from anywhere, anytime, because our focus is not the unit of analysis as the person. Our focus is the unit of analysis as the lived experience, or the experience as it's reflected in the autobiographical account. So if you look at the sample size is the number of meaning units in the data set, and the total sample size, or the total population size, would be the sum of the total meaning units across all of the data sets we got. So we'd look at that as like a target population sample. And then the unit of analysis, again, is the lived experience as provided in the account, and the unit of observation is the participant. So if we have 3 participants and they each have 150 meaning units, again, we have quite a volume of data, and we still have corroboration from 3 different data sets on the same kind of lived experience. So the 5-step analysis in Giorgi's method, and Colizzi was Giorgi's research assistant and student at Duquesne. He adds to this another step, which is the member checking. So when the analysis is done, he would go back to the people and say, how do you feel about the accuracy of my analysis? And receive feedback on that. But Giorgi has taken the position that that's unnecessary, because what we're looking for is general theoretical findings, not particular. And when we go back to people sometimes with our data sets and with our transcripts and ask them to reconsider, sometimes what they think is important to redact or what they might think is important to add really doesn't have to do with the general findings. It has to do more with their personal experience or their ideographic information. So first of all, once we have a transcript, we adopt the phenomenological attitude, and we're bracketing. So we're going to read this thing, the whole transcript, with an attitude of curiosity and wondering if a kind of explorative attitude, wondering if wondering for things new, being curious for things new that we haven't seen before. Then we're going to uh, after we've read the transcript for a sense of the whole context of the experience, we're going to reread and delineate the meaning units. And there's no precise size or number of the meaning units. It's just when the researcher feels a shift in meaning or a shift in topic in the transcript. And we're just trying to divide the transcript into manageable chunks. And then the transformation process starts with taking meaning units, rewriting the meaning units in third person so that we can get assisted in bracketing. So rather than say, I threw the ball, we would say P threw the ball, so that it's in third person. It helps us to remain bracketed. And then re-express the meaning units in their essential meanings using the imaginative variation and paying attention and being sensitive to the intentional structure of subject, act, object. And then once we've got all of the meaning units transcribed, we discern the constituents and title them. And then the last step is to synthesize the general structure and elaborate on the constituents individually, to talk a little bit about their context and how they can be a little bit nuanced, different for each participant. The theorizing and interpretation happens in chapter 5. This is when we go back to the extant literature, and then we take our general structure and constituents and what we understand about those, and we start to dialogue with the extant theory and with the extant literature, scientific literature that has different kinds of findings, to see if we can add to, correct, or expand upon what they've provided. So I already talked a little bit here on the last thing about themes. Themes that were not essential. Themes, again, are those things that are not constituents but might be really, really important and interesting. So this, in chapter 5, is the time when the researcher can say, well, while this was not essential to the experience phenomenologically, many of the participants, or a couple of the participants, experienced something within theirs that was context dependent, that context made this interesting thing come out, and that becomes a psychological possibility that the result, the reader might want to know about for applying this research to clinical practice or some other utility in the world. So that, I believe, is it. And I just wanted to see if you guys have any questions or any comments to make.
I really appreciate the clarification between what themes are here and from constituents. That's very interesting.
One of the things I'd like to bring up, first of all, thank you. I think this was awesome. But I think it would help novice researchers understand the amount of time it takes to yield this type of in-depth data. Can you address that?
Yes, I typically, when I chair somebody or I'm a methodologist for somebody learning the method, I will tell them up front, each transcript is going to take you a lot of hours. And Amadeo's late wife, Barbara, always did her own transcripts. And he suggested to me, when I did my work under his direction, to also do my own transcripts, because by the time you transcribe your own data, you become very intimate with it. I mean, the sound is in your head, and you're typing it, and you're seeing it, and then you have to listen to it again and check your transcripts to make sure they're accurate. So you go over this data in your ears and in your eyes and everything over and over. And just the transcription alone takes a day or so. Yeah. Just a simple half hour, 60-minute transcript, interview transcribed. But then to start getting down into dividing this up into meaning units and watching it shift, that brings some insights. And then going into the transformations. The transformations are very painstaking, and they, of course, take the most time. And oftentimes you can't start identifying constituents until you have all three transcripts transformed. So that now you can start looking across them and finding those things. First, they start as commonalities, but then you have to ask yourself, is this essential to the experience, or is it just a mere commonality that they had? And so by the time you do all that, I just have my learners keep track of the time in minutes that it takes them. And of course, I mean, they can keep track of time in hours, but by the time you do this, it's hundreds of minutes of just going over this data before you even get to the point that you're ready to write the general structure and talk about what that experience was like generally. And that's a thing that we need to be reporting right in chapter 4, is that this is the time it took to interview in minutes. This is the time it took to transcribe in minutes. This is the time it took to analyze in minutes. And then go through the other relevant descriptive statistics of the process, because by the time you add it all up, and I think meaning unit numbers are huge. Some of us might have a couple of sentences for a meaning unit. Sometimes they're a little bit shorter. But what you'll find in meaning units is that oftentimes you have more than one intentional structure in an expression of something toward an object. Like somebody will have a concern about A and a worry about B simultaneously. And this is really important to correcting actually cognitive psychology's elementary view on the mind, because cognitive psychology likes to talk about the human mind a lot like a computer. And what we find is not only do we have parallel processing, but we have bidirectional processing going on phenomenologically. So it represents the complexity of how the way people actually think.
Roger, how important is it to transcribe immediately after?
I think there's a couple of different advantages and disadvantages. I don't think a fresh transcription is really as important as one that is really, really accurate. Once you get into that audio tape, it takes you back to the interview in a very, very embodied way. One thing that some of the transcription literature will talk about is whether or not you include the and those kind of things that people do sort of catch up mentally with what they're trying to say. I think if it's excessive, I eliminate those things because I don't think they have meaning content. And again, what we're looking at is meaning units. So the meaning is the actual thing that we're trying to get at.
If I can bring up a point of debate, I actually, for the novice researchers, I require them to keep it in, because my concern is that unknowingly, if they start taking out the ums and the pauses, they might start to accidentally take out other things. So for the novice, I make them keep it in.
Which brings up the question for me is, do you keep the recording and sometimes refer back to that when you're analyzing and looking for meaning units?
I've never gone back to the recording itself to re-listen to it, because by the time I've got to the meaning units, I've heard it so many times that it's just there. I mean, you really want to go over it a bunch of times. But to kind of respond to what Jill's saying, I don't have any problem with that at all, because really what we're trying to do in the analysis is get at essential meaning. So if there's utterances that aren't essential, it's like statistics. You're still going to scrub out the noise through the analysis. So I think that's a good, what I like about that actually, Jill, is that it's transparent in a way that a novice researcher has to be transparent. Maybe somebody that's a veteran is a little bit more already proven. You know, it's sort of funny, but this is a craft, sort of like any other craft, and when you've done it for a while, there's a certain amount of respect to that. So no, I don't think that there's any kind of I don't think that there's a point of contention there. I think both can be right, but for the novice, gosh, you know what? If you have that full piece of data with all of those things in there, the little linguistic artifacts, then we can also say, too, that if those transcripts are shared with other researchers for other types of analyses, we can at least say the transcript is whole, you know? So I like what you say there. So anything else, or you think we kind of got it done?
This is fascinating, actually.
Awesome. So yeah, I think we really got down to the more practicalities of it, and I think that you know, I'm hoping that it will help other people that we share this video with. I really want to tell you all that I appreciate you for coming and engaging with it, because you know, certainly I could do this on just myself and do a talking head video, but I think that a lot of times we, you know, we lose the dialectical part between us, and you know, I really appreciate your questions and your comments, and I think it makes it a better video.
Well, I appreciate you inviting us and doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger.
It was great, Roger.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and stop the record then.